The single most significant development over the course of the past 500 years, in terms of cultural influence, technological innovation, and social transformation, has been the emergence of modern science. I would further argue that the advent of modern science is equally unparalleled in terms of philosophical, metaphysical, and religious significance as well. For many, science has come to represent the dawning of a new era, the ascent of humanity out of an age of blind dogmatism and into the clear daylight of procedural rationality and empiricism. Humanity, so we were told, would no longer be bound by blind adherence to institutionally sanctioned beliefs about an imperceptible and unknowable world which was guarded and mediated by an elite clergy of professional knowers of the divine. Science came to represent the very Protestant conviction in personal access to the profound truths of the cosmos, and the very humanist conviction in the ultimate value of human freedom. And yet, over the course of the past century, and the decades following the Second World War in particular, science has come to paint itself into more and more corners. The unyielding optimism of the Enlightenment, that nature itself was intelligible and available to reason and empiricism, has gradually come to fall by the wayside as science has found itself pounding against immobile walls, which we are seemingly unable to cross. The empiricist conviction in the epistemological primacy of human experience has come to be replaced by an almost religious conviction that our access to the deeper truths of the world must be mediated by titanic, exorbitantly expensive machines. Machines which produce arcane graphs and numerical figures which can only be understood by an elite clergy of professional knowers of the science. Machines which, furthermore, have theoretical presumptions built into their very hardware and software. The great scientific monuments of the postmodern world have become the self-confirmation engines of a new form of technological mysticism. The rationalist conviction that nature and the human intellect share in an underlying order, which facilitates the comprehensibility of the world, has likewise come to be seen as a naive misunderstanding. Instead, we are now told that our cognitive faculties are imperfect machines which have been haphazardly assembled by the blind watchmaker of algorithmic natural selection, and therefore that our cognitive faculties are oriented towards truth only insofar as truth serves the end of survival and reproduction. Our minds are thus said to be no more than a kind of impenetrable screen or display, which provides us with depictions of the world which needn't accord with what the world is actually like. The ultimate truths of nature, in other words, needn't accord with what we can actually see and touch with our ordinary experiences. Consequently, the truths of science have now become yet another imperceptible world, and our communion with that world must therefore be mediated by those who have undergone the occult initiations of arcane mathematics. The age of profound breakthroughs in scientific understanding has seemingly come to a close, and science itself, now a fully institutionalized system of authorized beliefs, now dresses itself in the aura of prestige, which it borrows from a lineage of long-dead celebrity geniuses. Credibility, not comprehension, has become the new currency of post-war science, and through these transformations, science has become transfigured into a perverse mirror image of itself, which embodies all of the sins which it has so confidently accused religion and spirituality of being guilty. What I will be arguing in this video is that this process, by which science has come to be inverted into a parody of itself, is not an accident, nor is it simply a result of the corrupting influence of money and corporate capitalism, as significant as that influence may be. Rather, this inversion was inevitable because of a deeply rooted incompleteness of the epistemological foundations which have grounded and guided the development of science since at least the 17th century. The descent of science into obfuscation and dogmatism, which we are witnessing, is the ultimate logical consequence of an underlying conceptual incoherence within the modern scientific worldview itself. This is a problem which will not and cannot be solved by even larger particle colliders, more advanced orbital telescopes, more mind-warping mathematical toys, or indeed by theories which stray even further from what is available to the concrete, tangible human experience of nature. This is a problem which can only be solved through a very serious reevaluation of the epistemological and ontological premises of science, which have now come to be unspoken and unaddressed implications within the nebulous notion of the scientific method. In order to find its way out of the labyrinth it has constructed around itself, science must actually address its own metaphysical presuppositions, and that is the endeavor which we will now be setting ourselves upon. In order to plunge into the roots of these issues, we must begin with human experience, the inextricable and ultimate epistemological ground of scientific empiricism. During what follows, I want us to keep a number of central questions in mind. What is experience? How can our experience provide us with access to the truths which condition the possibility of such experience? And most significantly, how are we able to recognize the patterns which we find within our experiences? Within his 1929 text, Process and Reality, the British mathematician and metaphysician Alfred North Whitehead attempted to lay the groundwork for a new way of conceptualizing the cosmos by reimagining the relationships between nature, consciousness, and the transcendental. In doing so, Whitehead conjectured that reality itself was fundamentally composed of self-generative, animate processes, or, put more simply, that the basic constituents of reality are not inert physical masses, but rather organisms. Whitehead tells us that organisms are themselves intricate, self-metamorphic, and purposive complexes of prehensions, or experiential relationships. All basic elements of the world, that is to say, are complexes of feelings. Such experiential relationships are brought together and synthesized through a process which Whitehead refers to as concrescence, through which the various constituent feelings are filtered and unified to form a singular droplet of experience, a defined and concretized event which is then incorporated into the living body of the past. Whitehead details 4 primary types of prehensions within process and reality, but for our present purposes we will focus on Whitehead's distinction between conceptual prehensions and physical prehensions. Conceptual prehensions are experiences of forms as such. These forms, or eternal objects, can be understood as patterns or as structures of possible relationships. As organic processes self-generate, they feel such forms and then selectively incorporate these potentialities into their own emerging morphologies. The forms ingress into the organism and thereby become participants in the stream of becoming that is the organism. Within my own idiosyncratic philosopher jargon, I have used the terms noemata, shamelessly lifted from Edmund Husserl, to refer to such conceptual experiences. On the other side of this polarity, we then have physical prehensions. Whereas conceptual prehensions facilitate the ingression of forms, physical prehensions instead facilitate the inheritance of the past. Physical prehensions are, in essence, sensations. They are feelings of events. past droplets of experience which have already occurred and which have thus come to be incorporated into the bodily composition of the past. Seen in this way, the physical world can thus be understood as the world of sensation, a world consisting in points of contact between the present and the past. When we look at our own bodies, what we find are continuous chains of memories. Every cell is the inheritance of a past cell division. Every scar is the inheritance of a past injury. Every breath and heartbeat is the remembrance of physiological events which connect us with the deepest roots of life on Earth. Generally, we presume that our experience of the world is the experience of the present moment. And indeed it is if we are considering our experience as a unity which consists of both physical and conceptual aspects, both sensorial and noetic dimensions, that is to say. However, if we limit our focus to the merely sensorial dimension of physical prehensions, then what we find is that such sensations are by definition experiences of events which have already occurred. Even light takes time to propagate, and thus our visual experience of the world around us is always the experience of moments which have already happened. We do not see the sun as it currently is, but as it was approximately 8 light minutes ago. For much closer objects, this delay is of a much smaller duration, but it is never zero. This is likewise the case with other sensory faculties such as touch. If we reach out and place a hand upon an object like a table, it might seem that we are experiencing an entirely static entity in the immediate present. In reality, however, there are no such things as static objects nor static instances of time. The table is composed of a myriad of self-generative processes, just the same as your own body. We encounter the illusion of stasis because in the case of the table, these processes are simply repeating themselves in essentially the exact same way, moment to moment. What our sensory faculties encounter is, by definition, the consequence of the conceptual realm. The discrete, already determined events of the past which our senses detect are decisions that have already been made, particularities which have been selected from much broader phase spaces of possibility which constitute the conceptual or noetic domain. To use the terminology of the physicist David Bohm, who we will be returning to later, our senses encounter the explicate order, which is the activity of the pre-physical, implicate order. To use my own jargon, the sensorial realm is the unfolding of the noetic realm, as nebulous, indeterminate feelings of possibility are woven together into the concrete, decisive moments of the past. From this, we can begin to see that there is an intimate and fundamental identity between sensation, corporeality, and memory. The inheritance of past moments of becoming. Furthermore, we can also begin to distinguish between physical inheritance and noetic inheritance. We don't commonly use the word memory to refer to our sensory interactions with the physical world around us, but rather to the recreation of past events within our minds. Such recollection reaches into the past almost as though the past itself were characterized by a kind of quasi-spatial depth. More recent events are experienced as closer to us in a sense, while older events are more distant. Unlike physical sensations, recollections are not bound by the relations of geometrical space. I don't necessarily need to be physically close to the place where a past event occurred in order to remember it. The noetic, or implicate realm, is one in which all things are, in a sense, unified into a sort of singularity, rather than being divided by spatial distance. So here we can qualify our previous assessment by saying that physical sensations are the inheritance of the immediate past, and such immediacy requires a kind of unbroken continuity. If you forget about something that happened to you when you were a child, then this is something that you can remember again later on. If your physical body stops working, however, then this is a break in a chain of memories which results in bodily death. Your body can't simply remanifest itself into the world in the same way that a recollection can. The physical world, therefore, is a thin surface or shell, which encompasses much deeper fathoms of corporeal memory. The physical world consists in unbroken continuities of sensory feelings which link moments together into chains which we can describe in Aristotelian terms of efficient or material causation, in contrast to the formal and final causation which characterized the noetic. Physicality is the inertia of repetition. Whereas the noetic realm represents the undecidedness and indeterminacy of conscious agency, the physical represents the continuity of habit. In 1704, Isaac Newton published Optics, a treatise on the reflections, refractions, inflections, and colors of light. The publication of the Optics was a monumental moment in the development of modern science, most significantly in the manner by which the Optics would come to solidify the presumptions of reductionistic materialism as the central paradigm of scientific inquiry as a whole. Newton's experiments showed him the manner by which prisms are able to create spectrums of color, and this led him to theorize that all colors are in fact contained within white light. As a scientist, Newton used his experimental methodology as a way to catalog a variety of luminous phenomena and thereby to begin developing a scientific hypothesis which could account for these various instances. Newton's empiricism was greatly influenced by the epistemological mode of thought which was canonized by figures such as John Locke. Within his essay concerning human understanding, Locke had distinguished between secondary qualities and primary qualities of the entities which we experience empirically within the world. Lockean empiricism holds that secondary qualities are those which are subjectively conditioned by the experiencer. Qualities such as taste, smell, warmth, and, of course, the visual experience of color. Locke and Newton regarded these qualities as secondary because they believed that such phenomenological qualities were strictly subjective. Scent, for example, was regarded as a feature of the human experience of the world, but not of the world in itself. As such, the British scientific tradition was oriented towards using such empirical, subjective impressions as a way to disclose the primary qualities of the world which were believed to be objectively real. Building upon the Cartesian division of mind and matter, British scientific empiricism presumed that the objective reality of the world must consist of properties which are strictly objective, while conscious experiences were regarded as strictly subjective and thus lacking in any objective reality. This distinction between the subjective and objective was the distinction between mind and matter, and for early British empiricism, matter was understood as synonymous with physicality. In other words, the objectively real properties of the world, which were believed to reside beneath empirical phenomena, were presumed to be the properties of physical bodies. That is, surfaces which are extended through space so as to form physical objects with objective properties such as mass, hardness, length, width, and depth. Unlike other merely subjective phenomena, these physical properties were presumed to exist in a manner that was entirely independent of human consciousness. Much as the Platonists had searched for the universal through dialectical thought, the British empiricists now sought the universal within properties of the world which were believed to exist independently of particular subjective experiences of the world. Physicality itself had effectively come to perform as a substitute for the notion of Platonic transcendental objects or forms. Contextualized by this metaphysical purview, Newton would come to conjecture that light consisted of a myriad of microscopic corpuscles, tiny BBs of light particles, which were intended to explain the behavior of light and color. Newton speculated that these corpuscles consisted of many different sizes, and that his prism generated a spectrum of color because of the way in which it was able to divide the beam of white light on the basis of differently sized corpuscles. Certain sizes of corpuscle would correspond to red, for example, while other sizes would correspond to blue. In attributing the behavior of light to these hypothetical corpuscles, Newton was striving to ascertain the objectivity which he believed to lie beneath the subjective, empirical experiences which he facilitated through his experimentation. He was seeking that which lay within the sensory impressions of light and color, the unmanifest, which conditioned and produced the manifest. In Kantian terms, we can say that Newton was seeking the noumenal within the phenomenological. Within the context of the Cartesian demarcation of mind and matter, we can thus understand why Newton presumed that the objective reality beneath the empirical sensations must consist in material objects with physical properties. Newton imagined the corpuscles of light to be tiny physical BBs because Newton was presuming that the objectively real properties of the world were those of physical bodies, defined by geometrically extended surfaces. But as we have already begun to see, physicality itself is composed of sensations. In attempting to account for the sensory phenomena of light and color by postulating the existence of imperceptible corpuscles, Newton was suggesting that what lay beneath those sensory phenomena was just more sensory phenomena. Additional sensory phenomena which were unavailable to Newton's senses by definition. In his discussions of the nature of light, Rudolf Steiner asks us to imagine that we are in a completely empty void of space. As you look in front of you, you see no physical objects of any kind, but only an endless expanse of darkness. We are then asked to imagine that there is a source of light behind us, such that the light is streaming past us and into the empty void. In this scenario, would you actually see the light? You would not, because there is nothing for the light to illuminate, and the light itself cannot be illuminated, as the light itself is the condition for the possibility of illumination. In other words, everything you have ever seen has been the activity of light, but you have never seen light itself because you cannot see light itself by definition. We can further generalize this insight by realizing that light is but one modality of electromagnetism, or rather, the ether. The repulsion which separates physical objects is also a result of magnetic or electrostatic repulsion. The feelings of physical contact which you experience with your body are also the activity of such etheric dynamics, as etheric phenomena are the mediators of all sensory experiences, all observations of the physical world. As such, we can begin to see why Newton's corpuscular theory of light was not only an abandonment of scientific empiricism, but also the initiation of an inescapable infinite regress. If we are to follow Newton's reasoning and conclude that light must in fact consist of imperceptible BBs, then can we then conclude that we have actually arrived upon a scientific understanding of light? Even if we could observe these hypothetical BBs using some sort of detector, then those detections would themselves be empirical, sensorial phenomena which would stand in need of explanation. Would we not be forced to conclude that the behavior of these light corpuscles must be explained by even smaller corpuscles? If so, then why stop there? This reasoning would seem to necessitate an infinite regression of ever smaller BBs, which are ever further removed from the concrete reality of empirical observation, the concrete reality of the human experience of nature. Are we really to presume that eventually we would finally arrive at the smallest possible corpuscles and rest satisfied that, for whatever reason, these most tiny BBs are the ones which we don't need to explain through the invocation of even smaller BBs? This way of thinking about nature has become so thoroughly ingrained and institutionalized within modern academic science that many might regard it as simply obvious. Many viewers of this video might be tempted to ask, how else could we possibly understand the natural world? What else could possibly explain the phenomenon of light if not some sort of physical objects? Others might be inclined to think that somehow the transformations of physical science over the course of subsequent centuries resolved this underlying paradox within Newtonian physics, but this is far from the case. If we look closely at the seeming paradoxes of quantum theory, what we find is the enactment of the very infinite regress which we have seen to be necessitated by Newton's reasoning. Even though modern physics has stripped their hypothetical corpuscles of the last traces of physicality, to such an extent that these so-called particles are now little more than equations which point to nowhere, the underlying Newtonian logic remains exactly the same. Contemporary physics presents us with a chaotic array of supposedly fundamental particles, which are believed to be in some sense physical, even though virtually all of the defining qualities of physicality have been stripped from these hypothetical entities. We are given exotic equations and lists of exotic unobservable entities, and we are then told that science is unable to give a coherent explanation of what the terms within these equations actually refer to, or what these so-called particles actually are. As will become more apparent as we continue, what has happened here is the ideological transformation of physicality into an inverted parody of the spiritual. Moreover, once we look more closely at the phenomenological implications of the Newtonian theory, what we find is that the Newtonian optical system cannot actually account for the very phenomena it purports to explain. Newton himself was aware that the same light can appear to be different colors depending upon context, a fact which we can clearly see in a variety of so-called optical illusions. If a given color were simply a certain type of corpuscle, then the same light should always appear to be the same color regardless of context. Nonetheless, we can see that this is not the case. Are the corpuscles of light changing their size in relation to nearby colors? Ultimately, Newton concedes this point by deferring to the Lockean distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Newton tells us that the phenomenon of color must be a secondary quality, a kind of subjective or qualitative stamp which the human mind stamps onto the physical data presented by the corpuscles of light. Somehow we must presume that the purely objective data input of these physical corpuscles can somehow become qualitative, subjective experience through the application of such phenomenological stamps which are applied by the human mind. Newton's theory of color turns out not to be a theory of color at all, as the actual phenomenon of color is drained from nature itself and relegated to the mysterious inner workings within the darkness of the human skull. This understanding of light gives us a rain check on actually understanding color, with the implicit promise that eventually some kind of advanced neuroscience or cognitive science can finally tell us what color actually is and why color phenomena appear as they do. Within such a materialistic mode of thought, nature itself is denied the experiential vibrancy which characterizes our actual empirical contact with it, as the qualitative aspects of reality come to be relegated to the seemingly impenetrable inner world of perspectival subjectivity. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the French philosopher Henri Bergson would illustrate the striking incompatibility between such materialistic metaphysics and the naturalistic empiricism, which was understood to be the epistemological foundation of the scientific worldview. Within his 1896 Matter and Memory, Bergson highlights the way in which matter is presumed to be that which lies beneath our experiences of the world, that which is truly objective, which conditions the merely subjective sensations we have of the world. But if this is indeed the case, then mustn't this necessarily imply that we never actually observe matter empirically? If empirical observations are subjective experiences, then matter itself must be something which is beyond the reach of empirical science by definition. One might then be tempted to conclude some sort of anti-naturalistic idealism, that there is no concrete, substantive reality which preconditions our empirical experiences, but such reasoning then runs up against a major problem. If sensory observations are the only real constituents of the world, then why do objects seem to persist and maintain themselves independently of our observations? We could say that these objects continue to exist within the mind of a cosmic consciousness, but even if this is true, and full disclosure, I do believe it is, this really doesn't tell us anything about why the natural world remains consistent in the way that it does. To say that physical objects are, at some level, really just thoughts may be true in some sense or another, but it is an explanation which lacks the degree of resolution which we need in order to really unravel the mysteries of mind and matter. Bergson suggests that we instead look more closely at what the world actually presents to us. If we are being true to the principle of empiricism, then we find only two categories within the sensory world. We have actual experiences on the one hand, and on the other, we have potential experiences. When I look at or touch an object such as a stone, my mind aggregates a range of experiences, and our minds thus come to perceive the object as a composition of potential events. The surface of the stone consists of a range of potential points of physical contact between the stone and other objects. The weight of the stone consists in possible instances of weighting, as it were, possible events which might happen if the stone were dropped or if we attempted to throw it. If I place the stone in a box, we don't presume that the object has ceased to exist simply because I am no longer observing it, because the structure of possibility itself continues to persist, and those possibilities could be actualized once more if I were to simply take the stone out of the box. What Bergson shows us here is fundamentally the exact same insight which we see within the works of Alfred North Whitehead, that the physicality of an entity consists of a phase space or field of possible physical interactions, possible sensations through which the continuity of the past is inherited into subsequent moments of experience. What we can thus infer here is that the actual referent of the word matter must be such complexes of potential intersubjective events. If we presume the word matter to refer to something purely objective, then we have rendered matter as something which is, by definition, unobservable, and thus, by definition, beyond the bounds of scientific empiricism. If we are to ever get underneath our subjective experiences of the world, then we must be far more radically empiricist than materialism can allow for. We must be able to see that the boundary between the purely subjective and the purely objective is an abstraction, which we have artificially imposed upon a fundamentally intersubjective reality. One philosopher and naturalist who saw these fatal shortcomings of Newtonian materialistic science was Johann von Goethe. Within his Theory of Colors, published in 1810, Goethe adopted a far more radically empirical approach to light, darkness, and color. Goethe carefully cataloged a vast array of distinct color phenomena, and in doing so, came to see that colors did not simply arise through the division of white light, but rather through the dynamic interplay of light, darkness, and human awareness. Rather than resorting to the conjecture of imperceptible entities in order to explain the phenomenon of color, Goethe instead insisted upon remaining within the phenomena themselves. Goethe tells us, "Look not beyond the phenomena for a theory. The phenomena themselves are the theory." Though the statement might seem paradoxical to the modern mind, when we look to Goethe's phenomenology of color, this is exactly what we find. Goethe carefully accumulated a wide range of color phenomena and documented the various ways in which these phenomena are interrelated with one another. Within Goethe's analysis, yellow is shown to be the experience of light through the medium of darkness. Blue is shown to be the experience of darkness through an illuminated medium. Red is the dominance of darkness over yellow, while green is the dominance of light over yellow. Conversely, magenta is the dominance of darkness over blue, and cyan is the dominance of light over blue. Shadows split themselves into magenta, cyan, and yellow, while beams of light become red, green, and blue. Goethe's theory, then, is not the conjecture of imperceptible imagined physical objects such as corpuscles. Rather, it is simply the structure of relationships between the actual phenomena themselves. By accurately accounting for the various phenomena and the conditions for their emergence, an overall pattern of possible phenomena comes to take shape, an archetypal, primordial form which Goethe refers to as an Urphänomen. What we see here in Goethe's color wheel is a structure of possible relationships, possible manifestations which are implicated within the very possibility of conjugating light and darkness. For those with eyes to see, what we have here is the primordial harmonic object, which conditions the phenomenological makeup of color. It is crucial here that Goethe refers to this harmonic object as a primordial phenomenon rather than simply a Platonic form, as within this choice of terminology is implicated the entire metamorphosis of Western metaphysics since the time of Plato. Unlike Newton's corpuscles, which were by definition unobservable, Goethe's Urphänomen of color is something that we can actually see. It is not something that we arrive at through a process of disembodied logical inference, but rather a pattern which we come to see within the sensory phenomena themselves. We see the phenomena with eyes. We see the Urphänomen with the psyche. But unlike Platonic forms, the Urphänomen is actually experienced in the world, or rather within the interiority of nature, which is disclosed to us as we render the manifest transparent, and thus intelligible. Goethe applied the same methodology to other fields of science as well. Within his Metamorphosis of Plants, Goethe likewise catalogs a vast array of botanical phenomena. In doing so, Goethe came to see that the development of all flora was characterized by oscillating phases of expansion and contraction. Quote, "From the seed to the highest development of the stem, we first observe an expansion. Then we see the calyx emerge by way of contraction, the leaves by way of expansion, the reproductive organs once again by way of contraction, and we will soon witness the greatest expansion in the fruit and the greatest contraction in the seed. In these 6 phases, nature ceaselessly performs the eternal labor of reproducing the vegetative kingdom through 2 sexes." End quote. Rather than regarding each plant as a static form which is achieved through development, Goethe instead sees each organism as a sequence of transitory developmental phases. The process of metamorphosis is not simply the realization of a final form, but rather each organism is a process of cyclical metamorphosis. Moreover, Goethe comes to see that within each of the various phases and constituent organs which constitute the organism, we find that the whole of the organism is implicated. Conversely, within the whole, we find the implication of all the various constituents. As suggested in our previous video on musicology, this perception of noetic wholes within sensorial parts is fundamentally the exact same process which we find within the experience of musical forms. An isolated frequency is not a tone, regardless of what the frequency is. The vibration has no tonal character until it is contextualized within relational patterns. When we observe such patterns within musical harmony, what we find is that each tone only is what it is in relation to the other elements which constitute the harmonic object, which we are actually perceiving as music. Likewise, Johann von Goethe found that each organ structure and developmental phase of a plant could only be properly perceived insofar as it was understood as containing the whole of the organism. Moving to ever higher levels of universality, Goethe came to see that within all flora was contained the implication of an even greater whole, a universal archetype of plant life itself, which Goethe came to refer to as the Orpflanz, the primordial leaf. During a meeting of the Jena Natural Research Society in 1794, Goethe made the acquaintance of the philosopher and poet Friedrich Schiller. Goethe and Schiller became engaged in a lengthy discussion pertaining to the nature of biological life following the meeting, and this discussion would eventually make its way to Schiller's residence. Therein, Goethe took a pen and paper and sketched for Schiller an image of the primordial form of plant life, which he claimed to have observed through his study of botany. Schiller responded by saying that this Orpflanz was not an observation, but rather an idea. To which Goethe responded that he was very fortunate to be able to see ideas with his own eyes. This remark is immensely significant in that it further illustrates Goethe's conviction that nothing is hidden from us by our experiential contact with the world. If we are failing to see the formative contents of reality, then this is because of our inability to recognize the ideational or noetic elements of reality which our sensory experiences are manifestations of. Moreover, it highlights the manner in which Goethe's phenomenological naturalism is not simply a regression into a pre-modern form of Platonic epistemology and metaphysics. Within traditional forms of Platonism, forms are understood to be static, timeless, crystalline objects. As with virtually all forms of pre-Christic metaphysics, the Platonic conception of reality unfolds from a central polarity of transcendence and immanence. Within such a cosmology, the transcendental, celestial realm is regarded as that of ultimate perfection and purity, while the immanent, natural world is regarded as a realm of imperfection and impurity. The Platonists believed that perfect things must be simple, and that complexity was therefore a characteristic of the fallen world of appearance. It was further understood that perfect things had no need to change or transform, as change was believed to result from a sort of inner tension or incompleteness, which was incompatible with the Platonic understanding of transcendental purity. Thus, Platonic epistemology was itself fundamentally transcendentalist in nature. True knowledge was understood to be that which was ascertained in a purely deductive, dialogical manner. It was through the Socratic dialectic that the human mind was able to divine the nature of the eternal, unchanging forms which gave definition to the chaotic, temporal impurity of nature itself. Nature, however, was regarded as the realm of mere appearance, as a sort of veil of Maya which the human intellect was required to surpass and transcend in order to overcome the fallenness of nature. In other words, knowledge of the forms could not be ascertained by naturalistic, empirical investigation, as it was understood that the realm of appearance was a mere shadow of the more fundamental realm of forms, which was the true object of human epistemic and spiritual aspirations. Nature was a realm of contingency and chaos, and thus it would have been deeply misguided to study the natural world as a means of understanding the transcendental realm of necessity and order. In order to truly understand the evolutionary emergence of scientific cosmology from Platonic cosmology, and in order to truly disclose the ultimate significance of Goethean phenomenology, we need to begin broadening the scope of our discussion so as to look at the evolution of consciousness throughout human history and the way that such developments have come to transmute our understanding of the world as a whole. Within his 1976 work, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, Princeton psychologist Julian Jaynes argues that prior to the late Bronze Age, we find no indication whatsoever of the notion that the internal dialogue of the human mind was experienced as issuing forth from an individual ego. When we look to myths, historical texts, or poems from before the end of the Bronze Age, we find no indication that human beings felt their inner voice to be something that they themselves were actively doing, but rather we find only the indication that the inner voices were believed to be the voices of the ancestors or of the gods. During the millennium preceding the birth of Christ, however, this would come to change, and it is during this time period that we also find the birth of virtually all of the major universalistic spiritual traditions, such as Taoism, Platonism, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and the Upanishads. This simultaneous, worldwide rupturing forth of new spiritual movements was designated by the philosopher Karl Jaspers as the Axial Age. Throughout this period, we find a movement away from the parochial, tribalistic forms of human spirituality which characterized prior epochs, and towards religious universalism. Pre-axial forms of spirituality tended to understand human ontology in terms of ancestry and kinship. A person was understood to be fundamentally defined by the concrete, tangible relationships of blood and soil, which contextualized and preconditioned their bodily existence. There was not yet any substantial understanding of the human soul as something defined by consciousness in an abstract, transcendental manner, and thus human spiritual traditions tended to be rooted in notions of civic allegiance or ethnic identity. Within the Axial Age, however, we see the emergence of spiritual traditions which focused upon the identity of the human individual in terms of human consciousness as such, or in terms of the relationship between the individual human being and divinity in a truly cosmic, universal sense. What we see here is therefore a dual motion towards a more individualistic sense of human ontology as well as towards the transcendental in contrast to the immanent. In light of Julian Jaynes' insight into the development of the human inner monologue, we can also see that these transformations occurred following the internalization of the inner voice. As the inner voice or dialogical psyche came to be incorporated into the human ego, we came to feel that our inner voice was something that we were actively doing, rather than something that was happening to us from outside of the thin membrane which divides ego from world. Our sense of self-agency came to intensify, and so too did our sense of being and individuality, which was not reducible to immanent relationships of ancestry, kinship, or geography. The human ego, therefore, came to expand, in the sense that it came to incorporate more of the human ontological makeup into itself, but it also came to contract, in the sense that the ego was now felt to be even more localized within the consciousness of the human individual. This greater contractedness of the human ego thus resulted in a greater sense of alienation between the human ego and the natural world, and this transformation therefore demanded the emergence of new spiritual traditions which were able to contend with this greater sense of individual alienation and the more transcendental sense of human subjectivity. Within the Apology of Socrates, we see the full implications of the emerging dialogical ego, as well as the acute conflict between post-axial and pre-axial forms of spirituality. The Socratic method involved using dialogue as a means to teach individual human beings how to discern truth from falsehood for themselves. Socrates boasted that this method could teach even slaves how to discern the world of mathematical forms with only their own minds. We can thus see in Socrates the way in which the dialogical ego resulted in a greatly expanded sense of individual self-agency. Pre-axial spirituality was not a matter of discerning truth through the agency of individual human intellects. Rather, divine truths were passed down from priests to initiates. The initiate simply accepted what was passed down to them, and therefore such spiritual traditions came to evolve in a largely social, transpersonal manner. There is no individual human being who could claim authorship of any given Greek myth, for example, because these myths developed in a more mimetic, transpersonal fashion in which the individual human intellect had a very minimal role to play. Socratic philosophy, on the other hand, indicated that divine truths needn't be simply passed down through tradition, but rather might be actively discerned by the individual human mind. The oligarchy of Athens, quite understandably, saw this as immensely dangerous, as they saw that such individual self-agency might result in the breakdown of the traditional beliefs which were the foundation of the Athenian social order. This malleability of the human ego is something that we can see at work in the conditioning of professional athletes. For most of us, we feel the activity of our hearts to be outside of the ego world membrane, even though we feel our hearts to be a part of our bodies. We feel our heartbeats to be something which is happening, not something which we are actively controlling through our sense of self-agency. Nonetheless, professional athletes who undergo rigorous biofeedback conditioning can come to exert an astonishing degree of control over their own heart rates. The activity of the heart is, at least to a degree, thereby incorporated into the ego of the athlete. But the incorporation of the inner voice was not enough to fully complete the internalization of psychical, conceptual activity into the human ego complex. Two more phases of internalization would have to occur, and we see the first of these phases emerge most prominently during the European Renaissance period. During the Renaissance, we see the emergence of perspectivity and spatiality in visual art, a development which is of immense metaphysical significance. Perspectival art is distinct from earlier forms of art insofar as it implicates the viewing subject within its own forms. When we look at a perspectival painting, the implied inner space of the artwork indicates a specific perspectival vantage point of the viewer. The Mona Lisa, for example, is not simply gazing out into some unseen world. Rather, she is looking directly at you, the viewer, as though the frame of the painting itself were a sort of window. Within this implication of the viewing subject, we also find the motif of interchangeability. The Mona Lisa is looking into the eyes of whoever happens to be looking at her. Every viewer is interchangeable with every possible viewer, and what this indicates is a kind of leveling out of human subjectivity which could have only been conceivable in the wake of Christianity. We see this motif of interchangeability further elaborated in the principle of relativity within natural science. Initially conceptualized by Galileo and then further developed later by Newton and most recently by Albert Einstein. The so-called laws of physics came to be seen as necessarily uniform, acting upon all locations within space in the exact same manner. Insofar as space is understood to be a perfectly homogeneous emptiness of pure potentiality, then we can say that space itself was not truly discovered until the perspectival revolution of the Renaissance period. Prior to the advent of the perspectival age, there was no space per se, but rather only location, which was not considered to be uniform and homogeneous in such a manner. In subsequent centuries, this motif of uniformity and interchangeability would be elaborated ever further within the emergence of engine technologies, which implicate the notion of energy as a kind of invisible, quasi-fluid substance, which remains a uniform principle of action even as it passes through various mediums and forms. Later still, we see this principle of uniformity expressed even more strikingly in the development of interchangeable parts through the assembly lines of the Industrial Revolution. Ultimately, all of these transformations are outgrowths of yet another process, by which the human ego complex has incorporated different aspects of the human ontological makeup into its own structure. While the axial age saw the incorporation of the inner dialogue into the human sense of self-agency, the perspectival revolution likewise saw the incorporation of private, personal subjectivity as such. Human beings came to experience themselves to actually be their own sense of subjective interiority. We came to identify ourselves with our own immanent experientiality. Within the modern world, we might find it almost inconceivable that we could feel ourselves to be anything other than our own subjective awareness. But if we look to previous ages, what we find is that this is in fact a very recent metaphysical development. Plato and Aristotle would have never identified the ontological core of the human being as subjectivity, as that which experiences the world immanently. Yet with Descartes we find the proclamation of "I think, therefore I am," a statement which, in an even more modern sense, we could render as "I experience, therefore I am." Consciousness itself comes to be equivocated with a capacity for experience, and the essence of human existence thus comes to be understood as the personal, private interiority of immanent experience. It is only through this internalization of experientiality that Descartes was able to conceptualize nature as a duality of subjective mental interiority and objective inanimate exteriority. This bifurcation of mind and matter, which has proven to be the most central motif of modern science in terms of ontology and epistemology, is grounded in a specific developmental phase of human consciousness which alone remains incomplete. Even in Descartes' meditations, thought remains conceptualized as the perception of clear and distinct ideas. In other words, Descartes still conceived of ideas or concepts as something within the world, not something which is generated by the human ego. Within the purview of modern consciousness, it seems almost tautologically obvious that the conceptual contents of experience are actually provided by the human psyche, rather than something which is simply given within our experience. But as we look to previous epochs, we once again find that this is a jarringly recent development. Quote, "And as there is evidently nothing subsisting in disconnection from extended, that is, physical objects perceived by the senses, the thoughts are within the perceived forms, as are the abstract predicates and the various states and affectations of the things perceived." Aristotle, On the Soul. As this example from Aristotle illustrates, within antiquity, the conceptual contents of human experience were understood to be provided by the world, not by the human psyche. Likewise, in Platonic philosophy, forms are understood to exist primarily within a transcendental realm, within which they are perceived by the human mind. Forms, ideas, or concepts are not yet seen as contents of human experience, which are actively employed by the human psyche as a means of synthesizing sensory experiences into intelligible unities. But within the early modern period, we begin to see the first germs of yet another transformation of human consciousness, one which, once again, manifests as an internalization of that which was once experienced as external. John Locke tells us that there is nothing within the psyche that was not first within the senses, the first intimation that ideas are somehow absorbed into the human psyche from the world. Shortly thereafter, Leibniz will qualify Locke's proclamation. Quote, "Nothing is in the intellect that was not in the senses, but make an exception. Nothing but the intellect itself. The soul contains being, substance, the one, the same, cause, perception, reasoning, and many other concepts that the senses cannot provide." Leibniz, New Essay on Human Understanding. Those familiar with the history of Western philosophy will see that in this qualification of Locke, we find already all of the basic elements which will eventually come to form Immanuel Kant's transcendental idealism, the synthetic a priori. But before moving forward to look at the significance of Kantian epistemology within this narrative, we should first broaden our scope in order to take note of just how drastic and palpable this internalization of conceptualization has truly been. There were no songwriters or novelists within the world of antiquity. Songs and myths were created in a transpersonal, evolutionary manner by culture forms, not individual human beings, and individuals instead served only as vehicles for that which was produced by the human life world in communion with the natural and transcendental domains of reality. The notion that the individuality of a human person is a wellspring of truly creative conceptual power was as alien to the ancients as were combustion engines and electrical grids. Creativity was understood to be a faculty of the divine, not of ordinary human beings. The word creativity is so common in the modern English vocabulary that we might assume that it is a word which has been with us for many centuries. We can find the word create as early as the 14th century within the works of Chaucer. The word creativity itself, however, was initially introduced to the English language by none other than Alfred North Whitehead in 1927. A date which seems almost impossibly recent, given how central the notion of creativity has become within late modern culture. Plato, despite his incomparable genius, was unable to look beyond the conceptual framework, which was delineated by the form language of the Hellenistic life world. The true nature of the forms was revealed through dialogue, through ascertaining the true meaning of the words which were provided to the human being by the societal form language. There was no real possibility that Plato could have divorced the concept of goodness from the implicit meaning of goodness as a linguistic object. Plato could not have conceived that the true form of the good, for example, might have diverged from the meaning of goodness, which was contained within the Hellenistic language game. A word is the body of a concept. A concept is the soul of a word, and within the mental consciousness structure of the axial age, only the bodily components of thought are seen to have been incorporated into the human ego. Conceptualization was still yet something which happened to us, not something which we felt ourselves to actually do at an individual level. the possibility that philosophy and spirituality might come to transcend the bounds of specific culture forms remained an as yet unrealized glimmer upon the horizon. In the modern world, by contrast, we take the conceptualizing power of the human ego to be as mundane as sliced bread and haircuts. We fully expect our songs, myths, and scientific theories to be ideational constructs which are produced by the creative authorship of an individual human ego. Coining a new word or using words in new ways in order to articulate a novel constellation of conceptual contents is a commonplace occurrence. But although this transformation has allowed for a profound expansion of individual creative power, it has also come to present us with an equally immense danger. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, following in the footsteps of John Locke, would come to bifurcate human knowledge into two distinct categories: matters of fact and relations of ideas, a division which we now refer to as Hume's fork. Much like Isaac Newton and unlike the philosophers of antiquity, Hume regarded human experience in a purely sensationist manner. That is, Hume saw the human experience of the world as fundamentally consisting in sensory experiences of physical properties. Concepts, therefore, were understood to be generalizations of sensory experiences. This led Hume to regard conceptual knowledge as purely a matter of relating ideas to one another. We can know that if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates must necessarily be a mortal. This knowledge, however, pertains only to how these ideas relate to one another. It doesn't actually tell us whether all men are actually mortal or if Socrates is actually a man, and therefore this conceptual knowledge only tells us about how these ideas interrelate. Matters of fact, conversely, are truths which pertain to nature. Whether Socrates is actually mortal or not is something which I have to actually look to the world in order to discover. Although Hume's division of sensory and conceptual knowledge might seem rather intuitive, it opens before us a fathomless abyss of metaphysical nihilism. Given that Hume regarded conceptual contents to be no more than generalizations supplied by the human mind, this raised a rather ominous question. How can we ever actually justify any sort of generalization about the natural world? I might be able to say that the sun has risen every single day before now, but neither conceptual nor sensorial knowledge can allow me to justify the claim that the sun will rise tomorrow. I have not seen tomorrow yet, and my sensory experiences do not allow me to perceive a regularity of nature which could ensure that the sun will in fact rise again. Human sensory experiences, in other words, never actually encounter any supposed laws of nature. Within this sensationist understanding of experience, we can only infer such laws through generalization, and conceptual knowledge does not allow us to determine what generalizations are actually justifiable. Here we find the exact same problem of inductive or inferential reasoning which Karl Popper attempted to grapple with in his Logic of Scientific Discovery, a work which coined the notion of falsifiability and thus laid the groundwork for virtually all scientific apologetics following the Second World War. I can say that every swan I've encountered thus far has been white. But in order to claim that all swans are white, I need to be able to justify this generalization. I have to posit some regularity of nature which can guarantee that we will never encounter a black swan. However, if logic can only tell us how types of ideas relate to one another, and if empirical experiences are understood to be no more than sensations of particular instances, then we lack any epistemological grounding for such a universal claim. David Hume, for his part, was perfectly willing to concede that such generalizations are never truly justifiable. We make such generalizations, Hume argues, purely on the basis of cultural habits or customs, and therefore all scientific knowledge must be regarded as irrational and culturally relativized. Within such a Humean framework, there can never truly be such a thing as scientific knowledge. During the early 20th century, Karl Popper would then attempt to maintain all of Hume's basic metaphysical presuppositions while nonetheless creating an epistemological framework which could allow for the rationalization of scientific theories. In keeping with Hume, Popper would argue that inductive generalizations are never truly rational, but would argue that scientific theories are nonetheless logical, insofar as they are purely negative in nature. Popper reasoned that although the claim, "all swans are white," can never be affirmed in itself, it can nonetheless be disproven, simply through the observation of a single black swan. It is a claim which is therefore falsifiable. Popper argued that scientific logic operated not through the affirmation of theoretical generalizations, but rather through the pruning away of falsified claims. Theories which made claims about the world could be disproven, and thus science could advance by discarding theories which had been falsified and maintaining theories which had not yet been falsified. Scientific logic would therefore operate in a manner analogous to Darwinian natural selection. Theories which were falsified would be eliminated, thus leaving only theories which were more robust. Although this framework would never allow us to actually say that a scientific theory was true in any positive sense, it could at least allow us to claim that a theory was less false than those that had been eliminated through falsification. Through this reasoning, Popper was able to present science as though it were not in need of any metaphysical or ontological grounding whatsoever. As long as we were willing to abandon the notion of genuine scientific truth, then we could do away with the need to justify any sort of positive, affirmative belief in a scientific theory through the justification of claims about the metaphysical composition of reality. It was through this Popperian apologetics that science would come to divorce itself from philosophy at large following the Second World War. Metaphysics could be abandoned and philosophy could be essentially relegated to the role of being the baggage carriers of the scientific enterprise. The problem with Popper's brand of scientific apologetics, however, is that it is ultimately no more than a hat trick, which is only able to operate through obfuscation and misdirection. If I have a scientific theory which makes a generalization about the nature of electrical circuits, for example, it is not enough to simply claim that my theory has not been falsified yet. If I'm going to actually trust the theory to make my light bulbs turn on, as opposed to killing everyone within a 4-block radius, then I need to actually believe that the theory will remain unfalsified when I pull the activation lever. If we actually follow Popper's reasoning consistently, we find that even though our current theory might have survived falsification while other theories have failed, we still have no reason whatsoever to believe that the generalizations made by the current theory will continue once I pull the lever. Just as Humean reasoning tells us that the sun might fail to rise tomorrow, Popperian reasoning tells us that we have no reason to believe that the electrical circuits will behave in accordance with our current theory rather than one of the theories which were previously falsified. If we are really going to concede that we cannot justify positive belief in any uniformity of the natural order, then we have just as much reason to act upon a falsified theory as an unfalsified one. After all, why shouldn't it be the case that our observations might spontaneously stop conforming to one theory and begin conforming to another? If we are discarding all metaphysical presuppositions about the nature of the world, then we may as well just flip a coin when deciding which theory to actually act upon. When we actually put Popperian falsificationism under the microscope, as it were, we find that Popper leaves us in the exact same position that Hume left us in during the 18th century, with no real justification for the simple belief that the sun will continue to rise, or that any regularity of nature will actually persist in a consistent and coherent manner. This is not just a problem for Karl Popper, however, as Popper's falsificationism has served as one of the most fundamental apologetic and epistemological groundworks of modern science since the end of the Second World War. As modern science has become ever more institutionalized, ideologically rigid, and bureaucratic, it has also come to rest on increasingly flimsy epistemological foundations. A much more monumental thinker and much more insightful philosopher who attempted to rescue empiricism from itself was, of course, Immanuel Kant. Unlike Popper, Kant saw much more deeply into the true core of this epistemological impasse presented by Humean skepticism, and what overcoming this nihilistic abyss would actually require. In his attempt to address this issue, Kant would further unfold Hume's fork into a quadrant. Rather than simply distinguishing between matters of fact and relations of ideas, Kant would introduce a second dimension to this scheme, one which distinguished between what knowledge was about as well as how the knowledge is justified. For the aboutness of knowledge, Kant gives us two categories, the synthetic and the analytic. Synthetic knowledge is knowledge about the natural world. It is that which must somehow synthesize the disparate array of sensory observations from a blooming, buzzing confusion into coherent understanding. Analytic knowledge, conversely, is about how concepts logically relate to one another, much like Hume's notion of relations of ideas. For the justification of knowledge, Kant gives us the a priori and the a posteriori. A posteriori knowledge is that which is derived from experience, and thus justified on the basis of what we actually encounter empirically within the world. A priori knowledge, conversely, is that which is justified prior to such experience. It is that which we can know as a matter of principle, or which does not require observational evidence. This then gives us a fourfold epistemological structure, consisting of the synthetic a posteriori, corresponding to Hume's matters of fact, the analytic a priori, corresponding to Hume's relations of ideas, and two additional categories, the synthetic a priori and the analytic a posteriori. The primary focus of Kant's epistemological endeavor would be the synthetic a priori. Knowledge about the world which is known prior to our experience of the world. Rather than attempting to subvert the abyss of Humean nihilistic skepticism by arguing in favor of universals which exist beyond the human mind, Kant instead came to internalize the objectivity of the world itself through his notion of the synthetic a priori. Kant argued that due to the fundamental nature of human consciousness, philosophy could come to discern the necessary conditions for the possibility of human experience itself. Rather than seeing the mind as a sort of blank slate which simply absorbed raw information from the world, as Locke had done, Kant saw that the human mind must perform a necessary and immensely significant role in the organization of sensory perceptions, such that sensory stimulations are actually able to be synthesized into coherent, intelligible experiences. These conditions for the possibility of experience, Kant tells us, are the synthetic a priori categories. Organizational principles such as causation, time, unity, and difference, which allow our sensorial perceptions of the world to be organized in coherent ways. Without such organizational structures of the human mind, human experience as we know it would simply be impossible. Kant then argued that because we are able to discern these initial organizing faculties in advance of experience through consideration of the necessary conditions for human experience as such, then our knowledge about the synthetic a priori amounts, in effect, to a universal ground of empirical knowledge. Kant argues that we can indeed have knowledge that the world will always manifest in a manner that is consistent and uniform in relation to these organizational principles such as space, time, and causality. This knowledge is possible, however, not because of what we are able to know about the world in itself, but rather because of what we can know about how the world is rendered by the human mind. However, Kant's metaphysical turn also necessitated a further bifurcation of the world. Now, between the world as it is structured through the organizational activity of human experience, that is, the phenomenal realm, and the world as it is in itself, the noumenal realm. The synthetic a priori seemed to allow for a grounding upon which knowledge of nature could be built, but this was only possible insofar as it was presumed that human consciousness never actually encountered nature in itself. All human experience of the world would now be understood as conditioned by the essence of the human mind, and thus the human mind itself came to be understood as a sort of metaphysical barrier which we could never, even in principle, step outside of in order to bring ourselves into direct contact with reality. The realm which was presumed to lie behind our phenomenological impressions of the world, the noumenon, seemed to now be utterly and inextricably severed away from human experience and thus from empirical science. We were now trapped within Plato's cave, which was now revealed to be none other than the cavernous interior of the human skull. This Kantian paradigm would allow us to make universal claims about how certain things must appear phenomenologically to the human mind, but it would not allow us to then compare our phenomenological impressions with the way that the world in itself actually is. Through this Kantian turn, the objectivity of naturalistic knowledge itself came to be sequestered within the dark, mysterious confines of human subjectivity. Within the context of the previous internalization process, which we have already begun to examine, we can see that our internal caverns were beginning to become almost unbearably crowded and claustrophobic in the wake of the Kantian Copernican revolution. But Kant's reasoning also leaves us dangling over the abyss of anti-realism which it attempts to save us from. Here we must ask, how do we actually know that Kant's synthetic a priori categories are actually universal features of human consciousness as such? How would we go about distinguishing synthetic a priori categories which are actually fundamental from those which might be conditioned by cultural or historical contingencies? If any of Kant's synthetic a priori categories were revealed to be conditioned by the cultural, psychological, or even ideological conditionings of the human mind, then these categories would ultimately amount to no more than David Hume's habits or customs. We would find ourselves exactly where we began, and as we have already touched upon briefly in this video, it does indeed seem to be the case that even seemingly fundamental categories such as time and space can be far more metamorphic and variable than Kant could have ever imagined. Kant leaves us locked away from the world itself within the prison of private human subjectivity, with only the reassurance that we all just happen to be locked in the same type of prison. All scientific knowledge is rendered as little more than psychological knowledge about how the world appears to us on the basis of what our cognitive faculties happen to be, with the only real hope of true objectivity resting upon presumptions about the way in which we are universally limited by our cognition. But Kant's subjectivistic metaphysics leaves us with one stone yet unturned, the mysterious hidden fourth, the analytic a posteriori. This analytic a posteriori would represent knowledge which is about relations of ideas, but which is ascertained and justified through experience. Kant himself shows hardly any interest in this hidden fourth, spending only a few brief statements upon declaring that such knowledge is conceptually incoherent and thus impossible even in principle. But now let us recall Johann von Goethe's response to Schiller's rebuking of the phenomena as mere ideas. Very well, then I saw an idea with my own eyes. Goethe further elaborates his methodology as follows. Quote, "When I see an object before me which has come into existence, wonder about its genesis and measure out the course of its becoming as far as I can follow it, I become aware of a series of stages, that is, particular sensory experiences, which I cannot perceive next to each other, but which I must make present to myself in memory as a certain ideal whole. At first I am inclined to imagine distinct steps, but since nature makes no leaps, I am finally compelled to intuit a sequence of uninterrupted activity as a whole by negating the individual parts, but without destroying the impression." End quote. In other words, Goethe is taking the particular sensory experiences derived from observation and synthesizing them through the active, purposive involvement of his own conceptual faculties. Through this synthesis, the discrete and separated sensory impressions are sacrificed, as it were, unto the realization of the underlying formative object, the phenomenon. The sensorial, physical manifestations are thus revealed to be particular activities of the more general and ontologically substantial reality which underlies them. The sensory realm comes to be rendered transparent, or as Jean Gebser would say, diaphanous. Regarding the phenomenon of plant life, the Orpflanz, Goethe tells us, quote, "The Orpflanz is the most wonderful creation in the world, for which nature herself should envy me. With this model and its key, one can invent plants ad infinitum, and consequently, that is to say, plants which could exist even if they do not exist, and are not, as it were, artistic or poetic shadows and fancies, but have an inner truth and necessity. The same law may be applied to all else that lives. Forwards and backwards, the plant is only ever leaf." End quote. The Orpflanz is, in other words, not merely a simple Platonic form or mathematical object. Rather, it is a phase space of possible formative processes, one which is defined through the conjugation of a range of more basic compositional motifs: expansion and contraction, ascent and descent, spirality and recursion, absorption and emission. While Platonic cosmology regarded forms as fundamentally simple and determinate, Goethe's phenomena are inextricably composite complexes of indeterminate potentialities. Moreover, the Orpflanz is not simply a static ideal in the more traditional Platonic sense. Recall again that Platonic philosophy regarded the world of forms as one of being, not of becoming, as change was considered to be a result of imperfection, which was incongruent with the crystalline purity of the transcendental realm as the Platonists conceptualized it. Goethe's Orpflanz, by contrast, is fundamentally metamorphic. It is an eternal event as much as an eternal object. What this all reveals, then, is that Immanuel Kant had eagerly strolled right past the exit door of the subjectivistic and relativistic labyrinth, which he was inadvertently wandering deeper into through his treatment of the synthetic a priori. Much like Locke, Hume, and Newton before him, Kant had presumed that our empirical experiences of the natural world were necessarily limited to the sensorial. With Goethe, however, what we see is the germination of what will come to be the fruits of the gradual process of psychical interiorization, which we have examined throughout this video. While the sensory faculties of the human body allow for contact with the sensorial, bodily activities of the natural world, the conceptual faculties of human consciousness can allow us to synthesize these disparate points of sensory contact into the imaginal perception of that which underlies them. We come to see the noumen which lies within the phenomena. The true compositional contents of the world are not simply thought, but now actively perceived, not with physical human eyes, but rather with the human mind. As Kant himself was well aware, this synthesis of sensorial experience is a universal faculty of human cognition. In order to even perceive a seemingly mundane object as an object, our minds must be able to cohere our disparate sensory perceptions into a unified mental image. In order for our experiences to constitute a world at all, rather than an incomprehensible maelstrom of disjointed sensations, we must be able to experience the numinous, noetic, compositional elements which generate and inform the particulars. During previous epochs of human psychical evolution, however, this process of noetic perception occurred in an almost entirely unconscious manner. The conceptualizing faculty of the human organism had yet to be incorporated into the human ego and the sense of human self-agency. Despite his proto-scientific dispositions, Aristotle, for example, could not have possibly come to perceive the orphlons, as doing so would have required that Aristotle be able to actively engage his own noetic faculties in such a way as to reveal the formative, ideational beings within the world which were not already disclosed by the structure of the Hellenistic form language. As we have already noted, Aristotle saw the conceptual contents of experience as supplied by the world, not by the human mind. But in reality, what this implies is that those conceptual contents were already pre-scripted, as it were, by transpersonal processes which yet remained outside of Aristotle's own sense of personal agency. It is only through the internalization of the human conceptual faculty that the human ego comes to be liberated from the confines of the particular linguistic superorganisms which condition the life worlds within which we reside. Unlike with modern philosophers like David Hume or Immanuel Kant, there simply was no possibility of cultural relativism within the philosophy of antiquity. Simultaneously, however, there was also not yet the possibility of seeing that the conceptual contents of our cultural language games might reveal only limited aspects of the underlying reality which they disclose. There was not yet any possibility of perceiving the multidimensionality of the noumenon. The conceptual synthesis of human experience was something that was done for us, rather than by us, as it were. And even today, this process is one which still occurs unconsciously, insofar as it has yet to become conscious. We might pretend to doubt that the sun will rise tomorrow, or that falling trees make sounds in empty forests, but in reality it is virtually impossible to actually behave as though we genuinely lack such knowledge, because, whether we realize it or not, we are always already perceiving the compositional forces which shape our reality. Human empirical perception is not and cannot be the mere sensation of merely physical particulars. In my most recent video essay, we examined the way in which the perception of musical form is in fact the most archetypal exemplification of this imaginal noetic insight which we also see within Goethean naturalism. The human experience of music is not the experience of frequencies, mathematical ratios, or even of individual notes. It is the perception of harmonic objects, which are structures of possible musical gestures. Tones only are what they are in relation to other tones, and the harmonic quality of a given chord is only perceptible through its relationship to other chords, its contextualization within the formative complex, which is the song, the noumen, the orphenomen. These harmonic objects are not made up of microscopic physical BBs. They are made up of conscious experiences, which synthesize a diversity of basic formative elements into organic unities. If we are able to let go of the Newtonian fantasy of ever more microscopic physical entities bouncing around in the void, and instead carefully attend to the actual relationships between sensory phenomena, then these relationships come to cohere into holistic, organic totalities, which we can see to be the harmonic objects which generate the sensorial world. But, of course, we must also realize that in order for a song to actually be played, its underlying noumen must be conceptually experienced by the human psyche and then enacted through the motions of the human body. The orphenomen must be more than merely ideas which spring into existence from some timeless Platonic heaven and then begin to mold the world as they see fit. In order for conceptual complexes to actually participate in the world, they must be mediated by consciousness. No matter where we look within the world or within our own awareness, we find no exception to this. Conceptual contents must be felt in order to be enacted. Let us look once more to Goethe's color wheel. Here we must ask ourselves, if the various compositional elements which together compose this noumen were already present and unified within nature before they were disclosed by Goethe's imaginal activity, then what, or rather who, must have been responsible for enacting this synthesis which resulted in the organic harmony which Goethe came to reveal? Unless we are to once again abandon empiricism by positing the existence of some disembodied and imperceptible mechanistic laws, which govern our universe for no real reason, then we are left with only one genuine answer to such a question. The harmonic compositionality we find within light, darkness, color, plant life, and nature in general must be the results of conceptual activities, noetic experiences which form not only the human psyche, but also ideational beings, which do not adhere within specific bodily manifestations. What we are seeing when we look upon the color wheel is not a mere idea, nor is it a mere scientific model. It is a rendering of the noetic composition of the eidolons, which work to breathe life and light into the metamorphic processes of nature. Or, put more simply, our depictions of the orphenomena depict the morphologies of spiritual hierarchies. Within physicalist ideology, it is presumed that thoughts are little more than physical computations which are performed by brains which are conceptualized as being akin to immensely complex, squishy calculators. If we actually attend to the phenomenology of our own experience, however, we find that our consciousness consists of two distinct poles, the physical and the conceptual, or rather, the sensory and the noetic. Whereas sensations are localized within extended geometrical space, conceptual feelings, or noemata, are not constrained in such a manner. The experience of a pinprick directs us towards a specific location within space, whereas an experience of the form of the circle, by contrast, is in effect everywhere and nowhere. What this then implies is that interactions between noetic feelings need not be mediated by spatial proximity. As Henri Bergson and Rupert Sheldrake show us in their examinations of memory, such noetic interactions needn't require proximity within temporal sequences either. Physicalist ideology must insist that somehow, someday, there will finally be an explanation of thought, which can be rooted entirely within the physiological functioning of the human brain. At which point it will finally be revealed that our thoughts are no more than nervous impulses, and the non-locality of conceptual feelings will finally be revealed to be an illusion, as we learn that our thoughts and imaginations are indeed occurring within specific networks of neurons. Until that day comes, however, this physicalist dream is no more than a fantasy, one which completely disregards the empirical reality which we actually find upon examining our own experiences of our own inner worlds. Once again, we find here that the maintaining of physicalist ideology will necessarily entail the abandonment of scientific empiricism in favor of conjecturing the existence of sensory phenomena which, by definition, cannot be sensed. When we look at books, models, or computer simulations, we are seeing the activities of thought. In order to actually understand such manifestations, we must perceive the thoughts which gave rise to them. Our understanding, in other words, must be noetic recognition, which sees through the markings on paper, lights on screens, or vocal utterances. Likewise, to see a thought within neural activity must be to see the conceptual contents which generated those sensorial patterns. The physicalist interpretation of thought inverts this, by presuming that we could somehow come to observe the generation of thought by the physical activities of neurons. No matter how much neural activity we observe, however, this act of physical thought production will always be unobservable by definition, as the thoughts which are allegedly produced through this process would simply not be available to sensory impressions alone. This presumption that human sentience and cognition are spatially localized within the physical nervous system is no more than another outgrowth of the same incomplete reasoning which led to the Newtonian corpuscular theory of light. With noetic perception, there is no need for the positing of unsensible sensations. The noumena which generate the sensorial realm are composed of the patterns of conceptual relationships which are actually present within the sensory phenomena. The truth of the phenomenal is perceived through recognition of such patterns, or, to borrow a phrase from Ludwig Wittgenstein, nothing is hidden. Non-local interaction has long been looked upon with suspicion and disdain by physicalist ideology, with one notable exception, the much lauded and ever obfuscated realm of quantum mechanics. But at this stage, we can clearly see that the allegedly inexplicable and incomprehensible paradoxes of quantum theory are simply the result of an attempt to understand the conditions of physicality within a framework which lacks any concept of the supraphysical. There have, however, been certain scientific thinkers who have managed to perceive the true significance of the distinction between the localized and the supralocal. One such figure was the American theoretical physicist and metaphysician David Bohm. Through his studies of electromagnetism and plasma phenomena, Bohm came to see that even the more mundane features of the physical world necessarily implied the existence of a realm which lay within the sensorial, what Bohm would come to refer to as the implicate order. Bohm saw reality as characterized by an interdependent polarity of implicate and explicate domains of existence. The implicate order is one in which all things are enfolded into one another, interwoven into a unified tapestry within which interactions and influences are not mediated by spatial proximity, but rather are the results of the intrinsic symbiosis of all beings. The explicate order, in contrast, is the realm of separation and geometrical extension. It is the sensory, corporeal world which arises from the unfolding of the infolded, implicate realm. Quote, "The essential feature of the implicate order is that the whole universe is in some way enfolded into everything, and that each thing is enfolded in the whole. In the implicate order, everything is connected, and each part of the universe contains information about the whole. In the explicate order, things are unfolded and are seen as separate and distinct. In the implicate order, things are enfolded into one another and are fundamentally connected. The explicate order emerges from the implicate order through a process of unfolding, and the implicate order can be seen as the deeper reality underlying the explicate appearances. David Bohm. Bohm's implicate realm, in other words, is the world of noetic feelings, or phenomena, and the eidolons which they give shape to. It is, put more succinctly, the pleroma, the compositional, formative domain of reality which materialistic science has been blindly and inadvertently stumbling into since the days of Isaac Newton, but which is now coming to be rendered patently visible to those who have eyes with which to see. Another immensely significant figure within this narrative, and one who was greatly influential for David Bohm as well, is the biologist and philosopher of science Rupert Sheldrake, whose theory of morphic resonance contributes yet another crucial dimension of the tapestry we are attempting to weave together here. We have explored the theory of morphic resonance in far more detail in previous videos, and I will be leaving a link to my dedicated exposition of this theory below. But here we will be focusing primarily upon the metaphysical and epistemological implications of Sheldrake's ideas. Rupert Sheldrake's work began within the realm of developmental biology, wherein he came to see that the gene-centric, physicalist understanding of life was unable to adequately account for what we actually find within the development and behaviors of biological organisms. Inspired by Henri Bergson's philosophy of habit and recollection, Sheldrake came to reconceptualize the notion of morphogenetic fields, which had initially been posited within the field of developmental biology during the opening decades of the 20th century. Morphic fields are phase spaces of possible development, which guide the metamorphosis and behaviors of living systems. Although this notion came to be largely abandoned following the discovery of the DNA double helix structure and the subsequent emergence of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, Sheldrake saw that this notion was crucial for actually understanding what we find within the biological world and beyond. The gene-centric ideology of neo-Darwinism maintained that biological forms were akin to computer programs, and that the programming language of life was somehow encoded within the sequences of DNA found within living cells. DNA sequences facilitate the production of protein molecules, which are the basic tools which living cells use to differentiate into specialized roles and perform specific functions. The neo-Darwinists, therefore, held that all phenotypic traits could be understood as resulting from the activities of distinct proteins which were synthesized by DNA. This presumption would come to be so thoroughly entrenched within biology that the term gene, meaning a heritable trait, came to be effectively synonymous with the notion of DNA sequences. What Sheldrake found within his early research, however, was that explanations which relied upon this framework tended to be inextricably incomplete. Actual protein systems, which were believed to be responsible for the emergence of morphological differences, were often identical between organisms with very different phenotypic traits, thus begging the question as to why the same proteins might result in different developmental outcomes. Something had to be missing, and the only explanation offered by the neo-Darwinian framework was that some other protein functions, ones which have not actually been observed empirically, must somehow be responsible for these differences. Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance conjectures that these developmental differences are not primarily caused by different kinds of proteins or the DNA sequences which produce them, but rather by a kind of memory, which is inherent to all self-organizing, organismic systems throughout nature. Rather than being contained within sequences of DNA, this memory must be fundamentally non-local. Organisms are less like computer programs, which are deterministically driven by a DNA code, but rather are more akin to radio receivers, which are able to tune into different formative possibility spaces on the basis of similarity. Organisms resonate with similar developmental decisions, similar patterns of behavior, or indeed similar patterns of thought, and this resonance thus allows the organism's physiological and behavioral development to be guided through the navigation of a kind of composite image, which consists of all the various forms which the organism comes into resonance with. These morphogenetic fields, I have argued, are therefore the noetic phase spaces which underlie and condition the manifestations of biological life which we observe through our sensory experiences. Morphic fields are non-local because they are fundamentally noetic rather than corporeal. They are structures of consciousness and potentiality which reside within the noetic, implicate realm of the pleroma, rather than within the sensorial, explicate realm which is the consequent activity of the pleroma. Morphic resonance must be a crucial feature of any esoteric or noetic science for a number of reasons. Morphic resonance shows us yet another way in which esoteric science comes to diverge from pre-modern forms of esoteric philosophy such as Platonism. The Platonists saw the corporeal world as a consequence of the transcendental realm, but this relationship was in no way mutual. The transcendental world was understood to be one of pure, immobile, and eternal objects, which were not subject to alteration. The notion that the activities of the mundane world could affect the gods would have been regarded as patently ridiculous. But morphic resonance shows us that there is indeed a sort of reciprocity between the corporeal and the noetic. The orphenomenon of plant life in general might be in some sense eternal, but when we look to the orphenomena of specific species of plants, we find much more specified possibility spaces and structures of relationships which are synthesized through resonance and memory, through the activities of the corporeal world, rather than simply being necessitated in a purely logical, procedural manner. The eidolons which give shape to specific biological species, in other words, are not simply personified eternal forms. They are formative complexes, which are shaped through the transmutation of the past into holistic unities through memory. The formation of the world is not merely the descent of light into matter, but also the incandescence of matter into the pleroma. Furthermore, Sheldrake's theory also implies that the imaginal perception of the orphenomena, which we see exemplified by Johann von Goethe, is itself a kind of sympathetic, or rather empathic, resonance. Through this imaginal faculty, our own inner noetic worlds come to tune into the formative, noetic beings which generate and guide the becoming of the world which lies beyond us. This imaginal resonance, in other words, contains the power by which we are able to transcend the boundaries which seemingly divide the inner from the outer, the path by which we must escape the Kantian, subjectivistic labyrinth is one of empathy. As empathy is not merely an emotional affect, but rather an epistemological faculty of truly cosmological significance. This empathic resonance is the means by which we come to see the interiority of the sensory world, and it is the means by which we come to see into the inner fathoms of other human beings. Our capacity to overcome the abyss of epistemological nihilism which lies beneath us, and our capacity to overcome the subjectivistic boundaries which divide us from one another, are interwoven within a singular, ultimate destiny of human awareness, and by extension, the destiny of life on Earth as a whole. Morphic resonance also shows us that formative influences occur on the basis of similarity. Elements of the past which are more similar to a present moment will exert more influence in constricting the possibility space which an organism is navigating. This once again illustrates the underlying polarity of the noetic and the corporeal. The corporeal realm itself is more than the physical and sensorial. Fundamentally, the corporeal is the past. Bodies are living complexes of memory, and this memory is carried forward by the inertia of the past. That which is already concretized will strive to maintain itself, and it achieves this through the constriction of the noetic. The corporeal poles of organisms are characterized fundamentally by separation and habituation, difference and repetition, to borrow a notion from Guy Deleuze. The noetic, conversely, is characterized by unification and creativity, synthesis and genesis. The implications of these ideas are immensely far-reaching and extend from developmental biology and chemistry into the psychological realms of ritualistic practices and addiction. All things are interwoven with one another, and it is through this dynamic symbiosis that cosmic creativity is able to continually realize itself. Consciousness, in other words, is always collective consciousness in its innermost essence. The world as it is presented to us by the ideology of mechanistic materialism is one in which meaning itself has been entirely drained from the world and relegated to the inner privacy of the human psyche. Here again, we can see that this interiorization is a consequence of the perspectival shift in human consciousness which began during the Italian Renaissance. In ancient form languages, written scripts were typically used to signify both linguistic concepts as well as numerical concepts. Letters, in other words, were also numbers. What this indicates is that for ancient peoples, the quantitative aspects of reality were regarded as a subspecies of qualitative aspects. Numbers were a specific species of quality, as there was not yet any distinction between physicality and consciousness. Yet, beginning around the early 13th century, a time period which is immensely consequential in this narrative for various reasons, European intellectuals first began using Arabic numerals in systematic ways. Unlike Roman numerals and other forms of alphabetic numeration, Arabic numerals were much more thoroughly divorced from the qualitative significations of ordinary language, and thus facilitated the emergence of scientific physicalism from medieval alchemy. Arabic numerals also brought with them the concept of zero, a concept which would foreshadow the mystical revelations of the divine abyss or transcendental darkness, which we see in figures such as Meister Eckhart, Angela of Foligno, and Hadovik of Antwerp during the same time period, and which we would later see developed philosophically by figures such as Friedrich Schelling and Martin Heidegger. This discovery of the archetypal void or abyss mirrors the interiorization of subjectivity into the human ego. The discovery of the blank canvas of private, internal experientiality goes hand in hand with this discovery of outer darkness, which would later become reified into the modern notion of outer space, which we find within science, science fiction, and fiction science. Furthermore, one of the most central aspects of this process of internalization was the absorption, as it were, of signification itself from the world and into the human ego. Prior to the European scientific, or rather physicalist revolution, it was simply taken for granted that meaning is a quality which is found in the world, not merely a subjective affect which human beings project onto a meaningless, inert reality. This internalization would grant human beings a creative power which was once only attributed to the divine, namely, the power to actively participate in the creation of meaning. But this newfound power would come at a cost, insofar as it would necessitate that modern consciousness rediscover the meaning which is inherent within nature in the wake of the physicalist de-animation of the world. One of the most significant figures in this rediscovery would be the pioneer of psychodynamic theory, Carl Jung. In his profoundly adventurous explorations of the human psyche, Jung came to find recurring motifs, known as archetypes, which he saw to be laden with symbolic imagery, narrative significance, and emotional powers. Through his research, Jung came to see that these archetypes were more than just fantasies, but rather that they represented the most basic elements of the processes by which the human psyche is able to continually generate and regenerate itself. What Jung discovered was that the human sense of selfhood is fundamentally holistic, organismic, and narrative in nature. Moreover, Jung also came to see that these archetypes could not be explained by the mere absorption of cultural ideas alone. Though some of these motifs were certainly laden within the cultural fabrics within which individuals were situated, Jung nevertheless found that certain images, motifs, and narrative structures tended to recur independently of whether or not there was any indication that an individual could have come into contact with these themes through mundane cultural transmission. In the early days of his career, Jung's approach to the archetypes and collective unconscious would largely attempt to adhere to the physicalist notion that these meanings must be localized within the human mind. Jung stated that the bizarre recurrences and synchronicities which he discovered were ultimately no more than features of internal human psychology, which then conditioned human behaviors and the human interpretation of the world. As his career progressed, however, Jung would increasingly come to see that such explanations were hopelessly inadequate to the phenomena which he sought to understand. Jung increasingly came to see that the collective unconscious must be more than a mere current of cultural transmission, that synchronicities must be much more than mere meaningful coincidences, and that the archetypes are found within the world itself, just as much as they are found within the dark interior of human subjectivity. Though Carl Jung himself tended to be very hesitant to advocate for any explicit metaphysical interpretations of his work, here we can offer a much more thorough understanding of these phenomena. By bringing Jungian psychodynamics into dialogue with the insights provided by figures such as Goethe, Whitehead, Bergson, Bohm, and Sheldrake, we can understand that the collective unconscious is in fact the implicate, noetic realm. It is, as Carl Jung himself would indicate in his later works, the pleroma. Meaning is not simply a means by which the human mind constructs narratives about the world. Meaning is narrative morphology, and the world we find ourselves within is one which is characterized just as much by narrative logic as by the logic of physical mechanics. Building upon the insights which we have explored thus far, we can go even further, in coming to see that narrative logic is actually more ontologically fundamental than mechanical logic. Though the interiorization of meaning has in many ways resulted in the world seeming to be drained of its sense and purpose, the ultimate significance of this process is that it is yet another condition for the possibility of genuine human freedom, that the individual human self can come to be an active, creative agency which is able to co-participate in the shaping and reshaping of reality. Within modern academic blathering, it is extremely common to encounter nonsensical statements like, consciousness is a controlled hallucination, or reality is not locally real, or some other variation which suggests that our experience of the world does not actually bring us into contact with reality, that our experience effectively amounts to no more than a curated heads-up display or user interface, which forever bars us from actually encountering nature as it actually is. Although these proclamations tend to be clumsily dressed in the language of modern neuroscience or quantum physics, it is nonetheless blatantly obvious that these statements are no more than restatements of the Kantian dismemberment of the phenomenal and noumenal domains. Modern academics are very eager to make such pronouncements because such a nihilistic epistemology fits rather neatly into the modern ideological position that scientific theories no longer need to actually accord with our experience of the world. In other words, theories no longer need to actually be empirical, but only mathematical. How very convenient. But if we are to take seriously the metaphysical implications of empiricism itself, then we can come to see that this Kantian anti-realism is in fact yet another outgrowth of the Cartesian bifurcation of mind and matter. We never actually encounter anything that is purely objective by definition, as all empirical observations are necessarily events of conscious awareness. If we are to stay true to empiricism, then we must conclude that the composition of reality itself is fundamentally experiential. Our awareness is not a purely subjective screen which forever divides us from an unknowable and unreachable world, because the world itself consists of fundamentally intersubjective feelings. The mantis shrimp is an organism with several astounding features which make it a favorite of popular science journalism. Among these is the fact that the mantis shrimp has far more color-sensitive cone cells in its retina, 13 more than the human eye. Some have therefore inferred that the mantis shrimp must be able to experience types of color qualia, or subjective color experiences, which the human organism simply does not have access to. This notion of qualia derives from the physicalist presumption that the objective features of reality are quantitative properties, or quanta, while subjective experiences are the qualitative stamps which our consciousness impresses upon inputs of physical information, such as waves or particles of light. What this would imply then is that the additional cones of the mantis shrimp retina indicate that mantis shrimp consciousness possesses qualitative stamps which our minds do not employ. Just as, allegedly, it is not possible to explain to a blind person what the sensation of redness is like, we are likewise unable to know what other sorts of color qualia might be found within the subjectivity of the mantis shrimp, which is effectively a black box which we are forever barred from by the insurmountable divide between the subjective and objective aspects of reality. But let us now take a close look at color itself. Here we have two diagrams, one representing the constructive interference of colors and the other destructive interference of colors. So now let us actually take a moment to ask ourselves, what could the mantis shrimp possibly see here which we might not see? Where exactly would these additional color qualia be hiding? Might there be a third diagram which we are missing which represents neither constructive nor destructive interference, but rather some mysterious third option? If we now look to the color wheel, one possibility does come to light, that the color wheel might be divided up with varying degrees of resolution. When we increase or decrease the resolution of the color wheel by implementing more nuanced color variations, we are not adding additional color qualia which go beyond the principles of constructive and destructive interference. We are rather introducing more subtle gradients between the colors which are already implied by the underlying geometry of color phenomenology itself, the orphenomen. What this then implies is that there are not and cannot be any color qualia within the mantis shrimp's mind which human beings can never access or understand, because color phenomena are not hidden within nervous systems. Color phenomena are actually in the world, and our visual organs are what allows us to distinguish between different gradients of these phenomena. There is no unknowable color qualia which the mantis shrimp has access to, because the additional cones of the mantis shrimp retina can only be organs of differentiation, not of adding qualia to quanta. When you ask a child why leaves are green, the child is very likely to say something like, "There is green in the leaves." When you ask an adult the same question, at least in modern times, the person is very likely to say something about our minds using the experience of greenness to differentiate different wavelengths of light. Once we begin to untangle the metaphysical knots which have been tied around us by the Cartesian bifurcation of mind and matter, we can begin to see that the child's explanation is actually the more accurate. The greenness is indeed within the leaves. In order to truly understand color phenomena, or any other phenomena, as the intersubjective components of the world, we must be able to understand the fundamentally relational nature of such harmonic composition. Phenomena are always defined through relations of difference, similarity, relevance, and association. Modern physicalist science offers us no explanation as to why the experience of redness appears to us as it does. Undergrad philosophy students often like to ask, what if my red is your blue? Perhaps when you look at the sky, you actually see the qualia which I experience when looking at the setting sun. How would we ever know whether our qualitative experiences are the same or even comparable to one another if such qualia are forever hidden within the black boxes of consciousness? Through the method of phenomenological naturalism, however, we can actually begin to understand what redness actually is. As Goethe's phenomenological experiments illustrate, color emerges through the dynamic conjugation of light and darkness. Yellow emerges as light is mediated by darkness, while blue emerges as darkness is mediated by light. Here already we can see a fundamental incompatibility between the reality of color which nature reveals to us and the Newtonian model, or that of modern physics for that matter. When we look at darkness through an illuminated medium, the darkness manifests itself as shades of blue. If we remove the darkness from behind the medium, the blue vanishes. If colors are different types of corpuscles of particles, then how could the darkness possibly be acting to alter what kinds of light BBs are reaching our eyes? The only recourse for materialism is, of course, to say that the blue is merely an illusion, that it is occurring somewhere within the unreachable confines of human subjectivity. The only recourse, in other words, is to abandon the project of actually understanding the color phenomenon by deferring it to some fantasized future in which neuroscience can finally do what physics cannot. But if we forego such deference and remain with the phenomena as Goethe insists that we do, then we can begin to see that the reality itself is not composed of BBs, but rather of processes which are fundamentally intersubjective and relational, all the way down to the core. The experience of the color does not occur within the so-called circuitry of the human brain. It occurs within the world, and the role of the human body is the dividing of our consciousness into more narrow streams which are able to attend to the specific, concretized moments which form the corporeal realm. The body, in other words, is a prism which acts to differentiate a more fundamental, noetic unity. There are no particles of darkness which must pass through the glass in order to reach our physical eyes and allow us to see the darkness as blue. The noetic pole of our consciousness is non-local. Our awareness is always already reaching through the glass and into the darkness beyond it, and the darkness is likewise reaching back into us. Darkness alone is seen as homogeneous emptiness, but recall again that light itself is also invisible to the senses. It is the invisible condition for the possibility of visual sensation. It is only through the interplay of light and darkness that the corporeal world comes to be illuminated. Within these color experiments, a cone is first illuminated from the left and right by white light. As one would expect, the result is two shadows, both gray. When a green filter is added to the left illumination, the cone is bathed in green and projects a black shadow. When the right illumination, still projecting only white light, is activated, the gray shadow is transfigured into magenta, the polar counterpart of green. We can continue these experiments by varying the filters applied to the left illumination. In each instance, the polar counterpart of the colored filter is revealed through the transfiguration of darkness into color. Light is the most fundamental element of formative power. It facilitates the formation of images, which are disclosed to our sensorial faculties. This formative activity, however, can only take place if there is a formlessness, which can come to be informed. This formlessness is what we call darkness. As Goethe's experiments illustrate, darkness is not simply an inert absence of light, but rather is a substantial medium, which can be transfigured through its interaction with light. What this all implies is that the transformation of gray shadows into colored shadows is not a curious optical illusion. Rather, it is a phenomenon which reveals the underlying archetypal character of all color, all illumination in general. When we shut out all light from a room, what we are left with is pure darkness. But of course we know that the objects within the room do not cease to exist. They remain, of course, and we might be tempted to say that the objects remain the same color, that the redness of the apple is still there, only invisible. But here again, we would be leaving the phenomenal empirical world and into a realm of mental abstraction, of unsensible sensations. If we are to remain with the empirical reality, we should instead conclude that in the absence of light, the apple and all other objects are in fact black. Insofar as the apple remains red, it does so within our inner imaginal worlds, within the noetic realm, not the corporeal. By simply attending to the reality which actually confronts us in an unbiased way, the world reveals to us a fundamental affinity of darkness and materiality. Within physicalist cosmology, we see a similar, though seemingly accidental, intimation within the notion of the black hole, a notion which in previous videos we have already shown to be utterly inundated with inadvertent archetypal connotations. The black hole seems to symbolically suggest an underlying truth of matter, that the final, purest form of matter is in fact darkness itself, that there is a fundamental unity of darkness, materiality, and gravity. The modern notion of matter is derived from the more ancient notion of substance, which was understood to be the archetypal corollary of form. Substance was understood to be that which was informed by the formative power of the transcendental realm. Materialistic science has long presumed that matter must consist of some inert, inanimate objects which are characterized by the purely physical properties of mass and extension through physical space. But in searching for this fantasized substrate of raw physicality, what science has instead discovered are distributed auras, or fields, of potential activities. What science has unwittingly discovered is the insight that matter is in fact the informing of formlessness, the shaping of the primordial, undifferentiated clay of pure being, pure oneness, pure stillness, what the 13th century theologian Meister Eckhart would have described as the groundless ground of all existence, the no-thingness which is sculpted into the corporeal world. The corporeal body of the leaf is molded from this darkness by the leaf's noetic, luminous pole. Its body is formlessness given form, darkness given shape, texture, extension, and color. Just as the interplay of green gave rise to a magenta shadow within our previous experiments, the green of the leaf is the transmutation of the darkness which is contained within the leaf into color. Color is the revealing of the texture of bodily darkness through the image-forming power of light, that is, the illuminating power of the noetic. Returning to the question of redness, we can first note that red emerges through the intensification of yellow. The yellow sun in the sky is light mediated by the darkness of the turbid atmosphere, but within this mediation, light and darkness remain equally balanced. As the sun descends upon the horizon, we see orange and finally red, as the darkness of the material medium comes to dominate the traversing light. Redness is the descent of animacy into materiality. It is the intensification of separation. All life emerges through division. The primordial oceanic unity of the uterine embryo is one in which there is not yet any sense of distinction between self and world. There is only the oneness of the womb. Through the process of birth, this Arcadian oneness comes to be divided, as a boundary comes to form between the fragile, helpless body of the infant and an external world, which is no longer self, but rather an ambiguous other. Blood, and therefore redness, is of course a central element within the process of birth. Within the animistic or shamanic culture forms of pre-civic humanity, it was said that women ceased to menstruate during pregnancy as the blood of the womb was being used to form the body of the infant. Within ancient burial practices, red ochre, understood to be the life-generative blood of the earth, was used to ensure the rebirth of the dead. The separation of redness is an archetype of paranoia and anxiety, as this division places us in confrontation with ambiguous and potentially hostile otherness. But it is also an archetype of generative and regenerative power. A living body strives to maintain the boundaries which divide self from world, as the permeation of those boundaries can result in injury or even death, physical or psychological. The power of the redness archetype within the blood thus facilitates the maintaining of such boundaries through regeneration, as well as the impulses of anxiety, fear, determination, and rage which are so often crucial for survival. Within red ochre, or the red bricks of modern homes, we see more earthen shades of red manifesting as a sense of nurturing warmth and regenerative vitality. Within sharper shades of red, we see indications of alertness, danger, fear, intensity, and, of course, sexuality. The anxiety of separation can implore us towards self-preservation, but it can also drive us towards the resolution of this anxiety through sexual conjugation. Sexual activities allow for the releasement of this tension and friction between self and world, as this boundary is voluntarily dissolved. The orgasm is indeed the little death, as it is fundamentally a reversal of the division which occurs through childbirth. We might more accurately call it the little unbirth. Blue conversely evokes feelings of calmness, serenity, and disengaged nocturnal reflection. Blue is rare in nature. Seen primarily within the sky and ocean, it represents the boundary between the manifest, divided world and the world of idyllic, transcendental oneness. Blue is thus evocative of the fantastical and the magical. It is indeed, as Goethe tells us, darkness mediated through light. The darkness experienced is the primordial oneness of the womb, which is now no longer an imminent bodily actuality, but rather an idyllic, symbolic object, a lure which draws us forward from the world of formative forces. I need to make this as clear as possible because the point I'm about to make is absolutely crucial. I'm not saying that these archetypal elements are associated with an arbitrary subjective qualia or mental stamp which we happen to refer to as redness. What I am saying is that the experience of redness is the experience of those archetypal qualities which are themselves in the world, just as much as they are within human consciousness. Redness and blueness are polar counterparts. The reality of the one necessitates the reality of the other. So, to answer the lingering questions of the philosophy undergrads, no, your blue is not my red, because there is no your blue or my red. Those phenomena are the basic elementary constituents of our world, not the inaccessible, arbitrary symbols of a private language game. There is only our red, only our blue. Johann von Goethe regarded his color theory as his most important scientific achievement, and he was far more correct about this than even he was able to realize. The color wheel is about more than just colors, or rather, colors are about far more than we tend to realize. Goethe's color theory is a window into the entire universe of formative powers which give shape to reality. This formative, noetic realm is not something additional which rests on top of a more truly objective substrate of physical, quantitative properties. Rather, the contents of this formative realm are the very conditions for the possibility of physicality. Feelings of potentialities ontologically precede the feelings of manifest particulars, which constitute the immanent, corporeal world. Modern science has tied itself in innumerable knots in attempting to explain the conditions of physicality by positing the existence of unseen physical objects. This project is both misguided and ultimately futile. Insofar as modern science has come to acknowledge this inadequacy, it has simply abandoned ontology altogether, in suggesting that our silly monkey brains are just too dense to ever comprehend the underlying nature of the world in a self-consistent and intellectually satisfactory manner. These so-called scientists tend to suggest that mathematical toys are the best that we can do, as our empirical experiences of the world amount to no more than a user interface which need not accord with what the world is actually like. Modern science, and in particular modern physics, has succumbed to the most ineffectual and degenerative form of Kantian anti-realism. They hand-wave reasonable questions by deferring to unknowable mysteries in a manner which is curiously similar to the caricaturized version of esotericism which they frame themselves in opposition to. Modern science necessitated its own descent into dogmatism due to its own epistemological inadequacies. Physicalism necessarily resulted in science coming to rely upon conjecturing the existence of sensory phenomena which are unavailable to the senses, even in principle. This path was always destined for the abandonment of human experience, and thus the abandonment of empiricism and naturalism. The unknowable BBs posited by modern science have been ever further stripped of their physicality. Until now, they are little more than symbols associated with numerical figures and measurements made by machines which are as far removed as one can even imagine from the empirical reality of direct human experience. The belief that these mysterious symbols and numbers might actually represent an unseen physical world was an act of blind adherence from the very beginning, the very same blind faith for which science aspired to be the cure. We do not need to wait with crossed arms for some messianic genius to give us the long foretold theory of everything, which will finally rescue science from the branch which it is so eagerly sawing off. All of the basic components of a new form of science, a truly empirical science, have been gradually put into place over the course of the past 2.5 centuries. All that nature now demands of us is to pick up those pieces and allow them to open our eyes. Nothing is hidden.